Okay, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Professor Kurt Waldman. Kurt joined Cornell in 2023, right? Yeah. Last summer as an assistant professor in the Department of Global Development. He studies judgment and decision-making related to environmental sustainability, climate adaptation, and food security. Kurt's also currently a principal investigator on a National Science Foundation funded project entitled Bridging the Spatial and Cognitive Dimensions of Farmer Climate Adaptation, along with a co-PI, Maya Jain at the University of Michigan. Professor Waldman is interested in the role of heuristics and cognitive biases. We'll probably learn more about that today in environmental decision-making and how decision science can be used to enhance the sustainability of policy outcomes. He uses interdisciplinary quantitative methods. He draws on behavioral experiments like econometrics and often integrates social and environmental data into his work. Kurt is also bringing his expertise in behavioral science and his insights into core drivers of decision-making to a new course this semester called Environmental Decision-Making. So if you're around next spring, you can take it for either advanced undergraduate or graduate credit. Prior to Cornell, Kurt was an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the Indiana University of Bloomington and a postdoc at the Ostrom workshop there. He holds an MS from Cornell in applied economics and a PhD in sustainability from Michigan State. Please join me in welcoming Kurt Waldman.
I'm very excited to be introduced by Terry. When I was a master's student here, Terry was a professor in the department and really welcomed me, and I enjoyed his presence, and I'm very pleased to now find myself here. So today I'm going to be talking about some work that has emerged out of a new project with a couple of colleagues. So this is with Jordan Blekking, who's a postdoc in global development, Chewe Nkonde at University of Zambia, and Maya Jain at Michigan. Terry already introduced me, so I'll skip over that. So really the core of this talk today is thinking about all of the advances that we've had in satellite data to date. This has really been the last 10 years where we started applying it to smallholder decision-making, and what those are telling us about farmer behavior and specifically farmer cognition. The advances largely have to do with spatial resolution, temporal resolution, and spectral resolution. You can see from this figure on the left that we're really able to pinpoint the edges of farmers' fields and geolocate them. This figure here is from our work in Zambia. You can see, if you look closely, you can even see mounds of maize in the center of the field, so they have just harvested. We really, with great precision, can see what's going on smallholders' fields. So in addition to these field boundaries, we're able to use satellite data to look at temperature and temperature impacts on health, changes in biodiversity and forest cover. This figure up here is nightlight data. So scientists have been using nightlight data to essentially detect poverty and development and see how small cities are expanding, for example. We can use it along with land surface models to learn more about soil moisture and soil moisture movement. We can learn about crop yields, and even with hyper resolution data, we can even get a sense of where parts of the field that are more fertile than other parts of the field. I'll be focusing today on the field boundaries and yield projections, and then also talking about downscaling climate data. In a lot of ways, these are sort of the two biggest areas where you see people using satellite data to understand smallholder farming. Field boundaries essentially just involve taking a GPS location device of some sort, measuring the size of the field. And then with yield, this is typically modeling that involves looking at the NDVI, or the greenness of plants in a field over time. The yield estimates also typically involve ground truthing, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And then downscaling climate data also involves modeling, but a lot of this is just with the precision of data we have now, looking at it at a field level. So it used to be that the closest you could get would be 30 meters, and so it'd be really hard to see what's going on, or to make the assumption that the data was representative of a given field. But now it's precise enough that we really can do that. So broadly, I'm asking, what are we learning about? What are we learning from using satellite data to study smallholder farming? And actually, more importantly, what are we not learning? I think is probably the more important part of this talk. And then what is it specifically telling us about environmental cognition? So the data I'm going to talk about today comes from Zambia. This is data that we collected this previous summer. It's about 630 farmers located in these hot spots you can see by the black dots there. We geolocated fields, and we interviewed the farmers, and then we also took crop cuts on those fields. So essentially randomly sampled in a field to get an estimate of what the yield might be in that field. And I should say that in a lot of ways, what we were doing is we were doing this measuring in service of looking at another project, or another idea, which I'm not going to talk about today, which is really how do extreme events shape farmer decision making? How do they shape planting choices and seed selection, et cetera? But what I'm talking about today is really just the whole sort of the idea of measurement and observation of farmers' fields. So there's two lessons that I want to drive home today. The first one is that farmer perceptions are important, but are often ignored. And I'm going to talk about this with field size and harvest. There's been this brewing debate over the past 10 years as GPS devices started becoming more common for measuring farmer field size, which is largely surrounds this idea that when we start measuring with a GPS device, we realize there's a big difference between what farmers have been telling us their field size is and what we measure it to be. This has a lot of implications for example, input demand functions. If you want to know returns to fertilizer, returns to labor, our estimates are going to be biased if we're using these essentially poor estimates that farmers are giving us. And so in this is really all from the agricultural economics literature. So really what we see people doing is trying to figure out, how do we correct for this bias? So in a way, you need to figure out why the bias occurs to correct for it. And so there's been different approaches, sort of isolating why they think the bias is occurring and correcting for it. But it sort of raises this question of, if farmers think that this is the field size, but we're correcting it to what we know it to be, what are we losing in that process? Are we sort of aggravating bias or creating more of a problem by doing that? A recent study found that the inverse size productivity relationship is fully explained by measurement error. What this means, what this theory basically says, is that as an area gets more populated, field sizes get smaller, and we would expect people to intensify on their farms. And what they found when they measured field size in 5 or 6 different ways and yield in 5 or 6 different ways, so everything from different types of GPS devices to a compass and rope method to get field size. And then for yield, they did everything from the self-reported data to 3 or 4 different methods of randomly sampling crop cuts to fully harvesting the plot. And what they found is that this theory that's been argued about for quite some time in the literature was fully explained by measurement error, right? So when you think about the difference between the self-reported data and the g.p.s and the self-reported and the yield, that error is what explains this relationship. You can't find the relationship without that. So it really raises this question of why does measurement error occur? And you will notice that I have it in parentheses in part because I don't think measurement error is the right way to talk about it. I will say more about that as I go through the data. So this is from our farmers' fields. This is all 630 farms. And this is their self-reported field size. And what you'll notice first is at 1 hectare and half a hectare, you have the most farmers, so over 150 in each of those categories. In a lot of data, you see very similar, trends where data is heaped here on these rounded numbers, right? So assuming that farmers are kind of rounding up or down. In our data, you also see this happen at a half of a hectare, and part of this is because of local measurement units. A lima is 0.25 hectares. And so you see people actually reporting that because that is the closest measure to their own value. An acre also pops up here, which is an acre is used somewhat in Zambia, much less than hectare or lima. And so you see some farmers reporting in that. The basic idea, this is kind of intuitive, not rocket science, is people are really just sort of rounding up or down to a number that is close to what they perceive the value to be. When you plot the farmer reported values against the g.p.s observed values, we see this trend that has come out in a lot of different data sets, which is that farmers on the lower end of the scale, so in this case, anything below about 0.5 hectares, tend to overestimate their field size, whereas farmers at the upper end tend to underestimate field size. And this same pattern has occurred in numerous studies with sample sizes much larger than the one we're using here. So similarly, we see misperceptions in yields or differences between the red is the self-reported data, the blue is the crop cut data. There's a difference of almost 800 kilograms in the total harvest. When we do the same plot with the same 45-degree line, we would expect to see if the data matched perfectly. We again see a similar phenomena where at the lower end, there's a lot of overestimation. At the higher end, there's a lot of underestimation. And this is for total harvest. Sort of begs the question, why are we seeing this phenomena across the data? And is it correlated? So is the explanation that people who, for example, are bad at estimating field size, are they the same people who are bad at estimating harvest? In some ways, it's sort of an obnoxious question to ask. I am not the one typically asking this kind of question. But what you find here is that there's a loose correlation, right? So there's a lot more going on than some people being good at estimating and some people being bad. There are a lot of people, the highest category is people who are underreporting both, and then also people over-reporting field size, but underreporting harvest. You could see a little intuition for why that may occur too. But in general, what I'm highlighting here is there's a lot that could be explaining, quote, measurement error, but we're not thinking about it more broadly. So why do misperceptions arise? The one sort of obvious point that I've already made is, which you see just with a cursory glance at the data, is that it's digit heaping or rounding at values like half of a hectare or a hectare. Zambia actually has pretty large fields. And so in many countries, all the farmers might be below half a hectare. And so rounding error could be much more significant there. The perhaps obvious point that you have been thinking about while I'm talking about this is that farmers use intuition or heuristics to actually come up with these estimates, not specialized equipment. So, we're essentially imposing this measurement style and device on them for both field size and yield that just does not have any sort of grounding in how they think about these two measures. It raises this question of what is going on here cognitively? If it's as systematic as it seems to be, then is there some sort of explanation? Do we see farmers, for example, giving us responses that are based on essentially their rosy retrospection, if it was data that was already collected, or their, optimistic projection for data that has not been collected yet? Are they downwardly biasing? Are they underestimating because of social desirability bias? They don't want to appear that they are the best farmer in the community, for example. Is there recall bias, anchoring, et cetera? So there's a lot of different explanations that one could explore here. And a lot of what I'm getting at is we're often not thinking about it in that way, right? We're just thinking about it in terms of, this is wrong, we need to correct it. What's the most precise way to do it, rather than how are farmers thinking about it? The second set of things that the second part of the talk, I want to get into the environmental data. And a lot of what I'm doing here with the first part of the data is sort of priming you to think about the environmental data and an area where I've worked more closely and sort of tried to investigate what these heuristics and biases are. So I'll focus on dry spell frequency and rainy season length. And the lesson here is we need to think more about conceptual mismatches. So do perceptions of climate data match observational data? So starting about 15 years ago, before satellite data was really precise enough, before we really had a good sense of this, there were a number of studies just using meteorological stations to essentially say, are farmers in this area recalling rain in the same way that these meteorological stations are recording it? Essentially, are farmers correct in their recollection? The problem with this is, in a country like Zambia, you might have 7 Met stations in the same area. In the United States, you may have 250. And so it's really just a sort of precision, lack of infrastructure problem that is likely explaining the discrepancies there. As the data gets better, so as we essentially are able to incorporate meteorological station data with satellite data, we start seeing people asking more complex questions about whether people's perceptions match observational data, and find that generally they don't as well. There's, most studies have concluded that there's still these discrepancies there. There are some nuances where some people have found that, for example, farmers are able to recall rainy season onset well, but they're less good at drought frequency and rainfall distribution. I've done some work looking at rainy season onset, which I'm not going to talk about today, but focus rather on the last 2, which is what we did in the project in Zambia this previous summer. So we use this CHIRPS data, which in some ways has been one of the best products for looking at precipitation over the last, going back in time. So it's a 30-year period where the data is available for most African countries now. The trade-off is the resolution is not great. It's about 5-kilometer resolution, whereas there are much more there are modeled data products now where you can get much better resolution, so up to 250 meters or better. We've also used some of those products for similar work, but we're just going to be talking about chirps here today. So this is just the number of dry spells that the farmers reported to us, with an average of about 2.5. And this is the blue is the number of dry spells that we projected using this metric that FuseNet uses. So FuseNet is the famine early warning system. They do a lot of essentially famine projection for the world. They just released some projections on upcoming potential for famine in Gaza in the future months. But you can see very quickly that the projections, when we use this FuseNet definition, which is a little bit more generous, so more than 5 days with less than 4.25 millimeters cumulative rain is a dry spell according to their definition. And it's not capturing how farmers are thinking about dry spells very well. So we then add another metric that is also common in the literature, so 7 or more days with less than 0.5 millimeters of rainfall a day. And we see that this metric actually captures farmers' ideas about when they consider a dry spell to occur a little bit better. Just highlights this point that there's many different ways to think about a dry spell. If we're not thinking about it in the same terms as a farmer, are there consequences to that? So the next thing we look at is rainy season length. So both dry spell frequency and rainy season length are these critical factors for farmers to essentially project prior to the growing season. So one of the biggest differences between seed varieties in Zambia right now is the length of maturity. So if you plant a late maturing variety, it's going to cost more money, but you will get a higher yield. It'll take about 6 months in the field. An early maturing variety might take 3 to 4 months, and you're going to get a much lower yield. But if your growing season is only capable of that, then that's your only option. So knowing about how long your growing season is very important for farmers. So farmers estimate it's about 140, 135 days on average. When we use this single day with 5 millimeters of rain, this is one way to think about rainfall that is perhaps more in accordance with how farmers think about it. So essentially, this is just the first day of very heavy rain, right? So if you're somebody who's a bit of a risk taker, you may just wait for that one day of rain and then plant. But as you see, farmers who use that kind of metric are expecting much longer growing seasons. And so if you're expecting a longer growing season than you actually get, you might plant a variety that doesn't have enough time to mature. So the next definition I have up here is the next metric is 10 millimeters of annual rainfall, and then it's cut off at 90 millimeters, or 10% of the total annual rainfall is the beginning and 90% is the end. This is more of a hydrological definition of rainy season length. And as you can imagine, this is sort of post hoc, right? So you're calculating this after the season has ended. This metric captures a lot more of the distribution of farmers. And I should also note that there really is, I forgot to make this point earlier, there really is a big gradient of rainfall in Zambia. So in the south, you have anywhere between sort of 500 and 800 millimeters of rainfall in a year, whereas in the north, you may have more than 1,200 millimeters. And so finally, we add this what is often sort of thought of as an agronomic definition of rainfall, so 5 days with greater than 40 millimeters. highlighting a couple things. One, there's disciplinary differences between how we think about this metric. None of those metrics really capture the distribution in and of themselves. Each of the metrics also has this sort of intuitive component to it, right? So thinking about a single day versus a portion of the season, or 5 days with pretty consistent rain, really might capture a farmer who's more risk averse versus a farmer who's more risk tolerant, right? So there's ways that we can sort of make a better effort to think about how individual farmers are considering rainfall rather than just using common metrics. What this highlights is this conceptual mismatch, and it can have really important implications, right? So in 2017, Malawi and a bunch of other nations bought into this African Union initiative, which involved drought coverage. The government of Malawi purchased it for farmers. It ended up being a year where there was widespread crop failure, but no payouts were made to any farmers because the metrics that were used by the African Union did not actually trigger payouts. They did not detect that a drought would occur. Some of my own work that I won't talk about today really has sort of made the point that you can use metrics to really align farmers' perceptions along with specific heuristics they use. So if you ask a farmer, tell me exactly how you decide when the rain's going to come, and then model that in the data for that individual farmer, you can really get almost perfect alignment between their perception and the observational data. The problem with that is even once you do that, you start seeing that if you apply that metric back in time, they aren't able to recall very accurately. So as soon as you go back 1 year, 2 year, or 3 years, it starts diverging, the perceptions and the observational data, getting at this idea that there are cognitive reasons why we as humans are not good at recalling and retaining large amounts of information. Some of our current work now is looking at what's called the availability heuristic. So if an extreme event occurs, my brain is going to be more attentive to that event than the history of the last 7 to 10 years, right? There are lots of ways where cognitive biases and heuristics affect us in everyday life. You can imagine they also affect farmers in the same way when they are trying to recall data. So how do we reduce these mismatches? What is sort of the solution here? Much of the literature from agricultural economics is focusing on measuring better, right? So there's lots of ways to train enumerators better. We can have checks within the internal checks within the survey. We can essentially try to reduce this through better instruments. There are also ways to correct or control for error. A number of papers, or actually maybe just one paper, has essentially figured out an econometric way to try to figure out the probability of something being an error, basically an error or a misperception. Is it something systematic, or is this just kind of a mistake in the data? And then as I was just talking about, there are heuristic ways to essentially create a little better coherence between the data as well. A more extreme version of this is just rely on satellite data. You can essentially take farmers out of the equation. You could just, we now essentially are able to remotely sense yield. We can use GPS boundaries. Effectively, what is happening in this process of getting more precise or being really concerned with precision, we are kind of pushing farmers' perceptions out of the data. And so in a lot of ways, what I'm calling for is how can we collect data better? How can we are there different measures that we can use to improve our data collection? Something that's more participatory or involves farmer engagement over the sort of large scale surveys that are common in this area. And then finally, studying heuristics, perceptions, biases. So not thinking about errors in terms of something to be corrected, but rather trying to understand why they're occurring. Part of what I'm getting at here is this bigger change in mindset. So we often think of farmers as having full information about the climate or having information about their field size or their yield or returns to fertilizer. But this introduction of satellite data, the use of satellite data is I think revealing that assumption is problematic in a lot of cases. Similarly, the notion of rationality doesn't leave a lot of room for people's emotional responses. There's a study from the US that essentially finds that if you ask somebody on a warm day versus a cold day, whether they believe in global warming or thinking about climate change, or whether climate change is happening, you will get a very different response. Maybe seems like it has absolutely no relevance in this context, but there's a lot of studies that sort of pull out these cognitive issues like that. The study of heuristics and biases, so basically the field of judgment and decision making, really sort of picked up in the 1950s. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky popularized it more in the 70s. And there are a number of studies now focusing on heuristics and biases. Most of this is just happening with decision makers in Western countries. And so, how do we sort of start taking these findings that, seem to be true of all decision makers and actually exploring them in this context where it's quite likely that heuristics and biases are prevalent. So one of the solutions that I am working on is testing visual aids. So essentially, how do we improve communication? If we are able to create a more data-rich environment, something that looks similar to what we expect in the United States. So in the United States, farmers have tons of information. In many cases, farmers are just working with agro dealers who have all of the information about their farm, weather data, seed performance, et cetera. Farmers aren't making a lot of decisions. They are just getting inputs and outputs, or they have the equipment that's doing it for them. How do we start creating a more data-rich environment for farmers in areas where there is no climate data, where there are no seasonal forecasts that are reliable, and they don't have good measures of field and their field size and yield response, et cetera. And then thinking about messaging too. How do we identify messages that actually are working for farmers? So something that I've been working on initially as a project with some students, but now this summer more on a larger scale is thinking about how do we create a decision support tool. So visualizing climate data in different ways and visualizing growing season length and some of the environmental factors that farmers are concerned about and iterating with them. So taking different conceptualizations, different visualizations, and showing it to them, getting feedback about what's useful for them. And then also, as I mentioned in the previous slide, thinking about their trust in the data and their experience with other farmers in the area. How do you actually communicate with them about the data? One of the things we're sort of heading to is creating a query builder or eventually some software that allows farmers to geolocate where they are, look at what climate trends have been in that area, and then think about the different seed types that are available to them that could possibly fit into that model. The problem, as you might be thinking about, is how does data that's online and an online tool actually get to farmers? And I don't know the answer to that part yet. We've been largely working through NGOs who work directly with farmers and have more of a sort of hands-on component to it. And a lot of what we do is just print out visualizations of data and take them to focus groups. So it's not a perfect solution in an area where cell phones are quite common, but smartphones are not. And so there's really a sort of technology gap that's hopefully rapidly closing. Okay, so the implications or conclusions, the more precise we get with satellite data, the more we understand that there is this difference between the perceptions and the observed data. In a lot of ways, I think we've been overly focusing on this as measurement error and not thinking about it as much as essentially what is it telling us about farmers? What are we not doing that we could be doing? Are there other explanations for understanding why farmers think the way they do about both their own farm and environmental conditions? And I guess at the expense of really drilling it home, thinking about these ways that essentially farmers have subjective perceptions about their own field and the environment, and what to do about that. How do we sort of embrace that, think about that in terms of the modeling we do, the interview styles we do, the data collection, et cetera, and essentially start reducing this gap. All right, thanks for your time.
Yeah, you can hang on to that. I'll get another one. Mike, questions?
Thank you, Professor Waldman, for a wonderful presentation. I really enjoy this stuff. As more and more data is coming up, we're realizing this is going to be more and more of an important issue. In January, I was in Nigeria with some students, and we came up across an issue like this where we asked farmers how big the irrigation plot was. We got some numbers, and we checked with somebody with satellite, and the magnitude of difference was not just by percentage, it was like 3 or 4 times more. And then I asked the people we were working with, and they said subsidy programs. So the strategic information that farmers give, if they think that this information may be used by government, by donors, by other representatives, they are more likely, for example, if I have a small farm, to increase it, or if I have a too big a farm, they think that this information might be used by somebody else for things that might affect them. Just wanted to tease, maybe in Zambia as well, you have subsidy programs. To what extent this might be an issue, this strategic signaling by farmers, as opposed to a measurement error?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that is a lot of what goes on here, and that is what is so hard to predict, right? There's situations where we can't know why farmers may be concerned about a particular issue. I think that even beyond that, I think there's ways where a subsidy program, for example, it's been running 20 years in Zambia. Farmers every year are getting 20 kgs of seed that's supposed to be for a hectare, to plant a hectare. Over time, that just influences perhaps their thought of like how big their field size is, or what seeding rate to put on it, et cetera. So, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the solution is better relationships with farmers, like working on, building trust, doing something that's a little bit more co-produced, because, the way we do large scale surveys right now is, I mean, I've been through areas where a farmer offhandedly will say, I've already done 3 interviews this season or something. So there's farmers that are just getting inundated with survey after survey. And, if it's a University of Zambia survey, are they going to give you better responses? I don't know, or different responses than if it was, Cornell University or, the National Statistic Agency, et cetera. So, trying to figure out essentially why people might have these, either unconscious biases and heuristics or conscious ones, I think is important.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I'm curious when thinking about misconceptions or misperceptions farmers have, what role their like community plays in that. Like we know that farmer communities and farmer networks are really important for information sharing. So I wonder if there could be like a systemic bias in the community if the word's getting spread that it's going to be a really rainy season, you know, but in reality the data is not supporting that. I'm curious what you've seen.
Yeah, I mean, so also not something we've studied directly, but one thing I've heard, this may have been from Jordan's host family in the Peace Corps, another farmer, is essentially this social desirability bias where it's like, I don't want to project that I am the best farmer in this area, so I'm going to give you a little bit lower number so that nobody else sort of finds out that I'm doing great, like just sort of a modesty baked in, or something in the other direction. So I think that like understanding social norms, like essentially recording, looking at like clustered data, et cetera, is one way to kind of think about it, but then really to dig in and understand why it seems like it's not going to be something you can capture in a survey.
Hi, very interesting talk. I would like to thank you for framing the fact as we need to understand farmers' perceptions better and not farmers are wrong, because I've seen a lot of paper around that, like measurement errors and then farmers not getting it right, which I particularly appreciate it. As a question, what do you consider that satellite measurement can help us to reduce like survey fatigue and a lot of survey rounds? So there are a lot of national statistical agencies collecting data, and you cited Carleto and LSMS. So I was wondering, what can satellite actually help us to do in that? And you can say, okay, I'm confident that this measure can be done by satellite and not us.
I think the one way I would respond to that is once we have geolocated field boundaries for a farm, in a lot of ways, we don't need to revisit those farms. There's, the satellite data is good enough in a lot of ways that we can, in some cases, detect certain agricultural practices like cover cropping on a farm. So there's lots of ways we just don't need to keep revisiting. This is totally unrealistic, but if there was a way where, everybody who was doing data collection in Zambia was sharing data, then we wouldn't have these like overlapping surveys. I feel like geolocating the field boundaries is one way to do it. There is a Gates Foundation project that makes that data available. There's obvious like privacy issues and concerns about like Ed was raising with like tax collection and that kind of thing. There's lots of concerns about it, but I think that just having the field boundaries allows us to, for example, look back in time. Like if you're looking at a climate related question, we know we can essentially see what practices they've been using. We could even estimate yields across that amount of time, and so there's just a lot you can do with that.
Okay, we have at least one question from one of our online participants, Eli.
Yeah, thank you. So Ginger Allington joining online says, when farmers are presented with these kinds of data, and I think the visual aids also that you're talking about, is there any evidence about how or if these then influence the development of their mental models or heuristics? Basically, how effective are these data and aids, and in what ways?
So I unfortunately the answer is I have no idea yet. This is just what we started doing. I mean, I think the best way to essentially figure out is to put data in front of farmers and see how they process data, and then in focus groups, and then do it on a larger scale when we can actually empirically get evidence about this. For example, like knowing a more accurate length of the rainy season, does that cause certain farmers to actually plant earlier than they would otherwise, or they have in previous seasons, for example? Or does it, we see this trend now where there's sort of a race to the bottom with seed varieties where most farmers are shifting to these early maturing varieties because they're getting told that climate change is happening all the time. So they're getting increasingly concerned about like, am I going to have enough of a growing season to actually grow a medium or late maturing variety? And so, once they know that, does it sort of shift the way that they plant? I mean, but also there's a lot of interpretation there too, right? Because some of the data, you may show like a 7-year period of rainfall trends, and there may be 1 year where there was a really low, a drought spell in the middle. And so it's unclear how, farmers might respond to having more data. We have a question from Carlos?
Professor, thank you very much. This was very interesting. I'm not sure if this is a comment or a question, but I'm going to try to make it a question. So I know there's a lot of different factors and concerns around georeferencing small farmers, but in Zambia, in the specific community that you're working with, have you faced like challenges with farmers that are located in protected areas? Like, I don't know, I know that, for instance, in West Africa, there's a lot of issues around cocoa production in protected areas. In Colombia, for instance, farmers very close to illegal crops. So I don't know, is this something like happens in Zambia that also might be affecting the answers of farmers if they are aware that they're in protected areas?
I haven't worked much in the protected areas. There are a few game reserves and protected areas in the north and in the south. But yeah, I mean, I would imagine the same kind of like trust issues emerging there. I mean, there's, conservation groups that have been working for decades with farmers to build trust and, essentially like create boundaries, like clear boundaries, and come up with the rules with what's allowed and what's not allowed to reduce all of the conflict in those areas. And so, again, I think it's another area where like more data could help, but then you also introduce a bunch of privacy issues. And then you also have to kind of figure out like, all right, what are people responding to? Are they sort of biased in some way? Are they hiding something, or et cetera?
Okay, we are, there's one more question. Yep.
There's one more question online from Steve Vanek. Steve, thanks for joining us. I think this is in response to your slides comparing reported farm size versus actual farm size. It says he's worked with nutrient balance data from fields and surveys which mix self-reported with some direct mapping estimates of area. Do you think that the relationships between reported and measured areas are well enough understood to be applying a correction based on global or local models, or at least considering uncorrected versus corrected scenarios in interpretation of results?
No. I think that there's some people who've come up with pretty innovative methods to start thinking about, is it an error? Is it a misperception? Is it, is there a correlation between sort of field size and yield? But most of it is just, most of it's just sort of new and not well tested. And I think that a lot of it's just modeled. We don't know how well that maps onto actual like farmer responses and experiences with it.
Okay, before we extend our thanks, we have